Speaker, make it clear.
Order. I did not make the comment.
Well, it's not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Over the next 3 weeks, Citizen A is focusing like a laser beam on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement meeting that is starting in Auckland next week. Joining me to discuss the ramifications of free trade with our new American corporate overlords, she is one of New Zealand's best-known academics and critics of free trade, Professor of Law, Policy and International Economic Regulation, Professor Jane Kelsey, and she has been described as Ralph Nader with a sense of humour, which seems very, very harsh on poor Ralph Nader. Harvard-trained lawyer, director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. We are very lucky to have the one, the only, Wallach. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1, why should New Zealanders be concerned with signing up to the TPPA? Issue 2, why would our government agree to a deal that didn't benefit New Zealand's interests? And Issue 3, how much is the TPPA a manifestation of the American-Chinese New Cold War in the Pacific? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with Issue 1. The Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations start their 15th round of talks in Auckland next week to hammer out a secret trade deal that will hand New Zealand's economic sovereignty over to legal jurisdictions that seem heavily weighted in favour of American corporations. Jane, is this just a theoretical threat that you are responding to on an academic principle, or does the TPPA have a direct consequence on the lives of New Zealanders?
I think the fact that it is surrounded by such secrecy shows what dynamite it is. If the government really thought it was in New Zealand's interests, they would be prepared to get out from behind the closed doors, put this text out into the public arena, allow us to debate the consequences, and then go with the flow. They're not prepared to do that.
The argument they always use when the level of secrecy is brought up, the argument they always use is, well, we have to negotiate in secret. How legitimate is that?
Well, they have to negotiate in secret if they want to pull the deal off, because it'd never be saleable if we knew what was in it. Right,
so it's more a case of they need the secrecy because New Zealanders just wouldn't agree to go along with it.
Well, if you look at the way that they've reacted to the leaks, and one of the ways that we actually do know some of what's in there is because a number of the chapters have been leaked. There's 29 chapters in this thing, yeah? And we've seen about 5 of them, and that's enough to make us want to jump off the cliff. Right. Although take them with us. What we really need to understand is that they are talking about this agreement not as a trade agreement. This is not about a trade agreement. They say this agreement's going to go further behind the border in putting a straitjacket on our government's future policies and laws than any previous government. So think bans on fracking, or even a moratorium on fracking, tying up the kind of deregulation that dealt with Pike River and the health and safety issues there, the financial crisis and the collapse of the finance companies, all of that leaky buildings, all of the deregulatory disasters we've had. If this agreement was signed, the corporations who would have an interest would come in and say, what's the problem with the rules? And threaten then to sue us in these offshore tribunals if we tighten them in a way that impacts on their profitability in a substantial way.
Laurie, you have 20 years history of free trade deals in the US. What is the American experience of free trade been?
Well, that's unfortunately why we know it's not a hypothetical threat. TPP is an expansion of a very specific model based on the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. The outcomes of that have been horrific. In the corporate tribunals, which TPP would expand, where corporations can go and sue our governments, skirting our domestic laws, going to foreign tribunals to extract unlimited sums of our taxpayer money, over $600 million has been paid out under the NAFTA-style agreements we've had so far. Not about expropriation, about regulatory policy, undermining the ability of governments to ban toxics that are destroying our water, to regulate forestry, to use zoning, to have permits about what kind, can there be a toxic waste dump over a water aquifer? The most basic kinds of government actions are undermined by these agreements, which literally are a way of formalizing corporate rule. So they're branded as a trade agreement.
Right,
It's sort of a Trojan horse strategy. Everyone thinks, oh, more exports. We all hear the same siren song, more jobs, happiness. In fact, whenever you get to see the text, and in this case of TPP, the leaked ones have been very, very scary.
Right, yeah.
You find out TPP, 29 chapters, only 5 of them have anything to do with trade. 24 chapters of imposing top-down limits, handcuffs on our abilities in democracies to decide our futures, strangling our governments, and stealing out of our taxpayer pockets untold billions to be shifted directly to corporations.
What has the American resistance looked like over 20 years to that corporatization of their democracy?
The word NAFTA has become such a bad word that in the 2012 presidential and congressional elections, it was an unprecedented use of paid television ads where the ads basically said, that guy's for NAFTA, he's for offshoring. And then the guy who may or may not have voted for it says, that one's more for NAFTA. He likes 2 NAFTAs. You're 3 NAFTAs.
So it's quite terminal. The phrase is now
polling
right.
Is unbelievable. In our country, it's so polarized. The only thing that Democrats, Republicans, Independents agree on, no more NAFTAs. And it's even moved up all the way through the income brackets up to 120,000. So 4 quintiles of U.S. population, only the richest of the rich, now actually are basically neutral. No one is cheerleading. All 4 up to $120,000, and the polling is done by the Wall Street Journal, which is
hardly a left-wing organ,
and so
is it?
they say bad for our families, bad for the country.
Yeah.
And this is what, why did I haul halfway around the world? Number one, it's a warning of what our lived experience has been. I mean, our manufacturing has been hollowed out.
Yes.
We've been flooded with unsafe imported foods and products. We've had all of this taxpayer money extracted, important laws attacked, financial deregulation promoted by these agreements, none of it about trade. And then we didn't get the trade part benefits.
Right.
Ultimately, all those promised jobs, the U.S. has lost 5 million of its manufacturing jobs. 1 out of every 4 that existed in our country before NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, gone. Our median real wages in inflation-adjusted terms, 1972 levels. We did this to ourselves. We should not do this to more countries.
Jane, why are we still locked in the Milton Friedman-style free market dogma? Aren't we all Keynesians now after the 2008 global financial crash? Is this economics or reassertion of the Washington Consensus?
Well, you know how ideology works in this country.
We don't mention it.
No, and that's because they claim this is orthodoxy. It's failed orthodoxy. We're seeing all around the world it's failed orthodoxy. We're seeing debates here about the failure of the orthodoxy. At the same time, we're seeing a determination to lock it in so that we can't move in another direction. And that's, I think, what the lessons for us are of how these kinds of agreements have been used elsewhere. And the dogma that drives it is even now being questioned in the Labour Party. And the Labour Party conference last week passed a resolution that said they would only support a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement which had a whole list of prerequisites that will never occur. And it's going to be, I think, an interesting internal battle as to whether Phil Goff and Clayton Cosgrove, who hold the relevant shadow portfolios, actually get to continue with the pro line, or whether the internal discussions about the impacts on innovation economy, the impacts on the fundamentals of the healthcare system, of the access to real health and safety laws, reversing the ACC privatisations when the Nats go ahead with it, whether all of those core Labour policies will be deliverable. Because if they've locked the door on them on pain of threat by corporations and foreign states, especially the US, to sue the Pence office if we decide that actually Tina is not alive and well, that's the goal. And you can see why it's so attractive to John Key. Because it's a way that they can, along with their private sector cronies, shut the door on a different future.
Laurie, right-wing commentator in New Zealand, Herald columnist Fran O'Sullivan wrote today that the University of Auckland needs to promote intellectual opponents to Jane Kelsey, also name-checked you there. How important is it to the pushers of free trade to absolutely silence academic critics?
Well, not just academic critics. It's not in their favor to have a debate because they have no substantive winning case. So even in our country, President Obama has stopped talking about, he won't engage with. Members of Congress are starting to holler about TPP, including those who in the past have supported trade agreements, and President Obama will just take the sort of and hope the story goes away, because if he engages, he makes the news cycle spin. This gets to the question you asked Jane, which is, how is it this failed ideology? That's precisely the mechanism of TPP. It is to cement in this old failed way, because what many people don't think about, 29 TPP chapters, again, most of them not about trade. Every country is required, signatory party shall conform all domestic laws, regulations, administrative procedures to the agreement, which means you are permanently, because it has no expiration date, for all future and existing law, required to rewrite everything to meet these corporate rules. So what's happening? We have 600 official corporate advisors to the U.S. Trade Representative. These are the same folks who hate financial re-regulation in the U.S. and want to roll it back. They hate Obama's health care reform. We're finally starting to use formularies. Nothing as good as your Farm Act, but we're learning slowly not to be totally ripped off by Big Pharma. They hate that. The pharmaceutical companies are nuts. Disney tried to put crazy copyright rules through our Congress, and they were stopped. So what are they doing? They're loading up the TPP, not just to export and lock in the rest of the world, but to boomerang it back to us, what they can't get done in Congress, and to lock it in permanently. That is exactly because their ideology is failing. I mean, this agreement has a ban on capital controls. How are you ever going to deal with New Zealand's balance of payment problems if you never can have any inflow and outflow rules?
Well, quick question to both of you then, on this, finally on this segment of the show. Why is it that the 600 representatives from pharmaceutical and film corporations, they're allowed to see a draft text of the entire agreement, but you're not? Why is that the case?
Well, I think it comes back to the fact that they can't sustain it. If they release it, they won't get it through. And it's as simple as that. Is
that what we're seeing, just a censorship of information so that the debate can't actually be entered into?
There's an interesting problem in our country where constitutionally only the Congress can set our trade policies, but only the president can negotiate. So the president's negotiating agency has 600 advisors. There has been no delegation of authority, so whatever the negotiators sign isn't necessarily what New Zealand's going to get. And those advisors, thus, without any congressional authority being set, are calling the shots. So they set what the rules are, they get to see what it is. There's no one standing up for the public, for Congress. It's a serious structural problem.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. In 2010, WikiLeaks leaked a secret email from New Zealand's chief trade negotiator, Mark Sinclair, to a US State Department official that New Zealand had little to gain from a free trade deal with the US, and that the difficult bit would be convincing New Zealanders into thinking we had gained anything, despite John Key claiming in November 2009 that the free trade deal would be worth billions and billions. Laurie, why would our government agree to a deal that didn't benefit New Zealand? It's counterintuitive.
To quote The Godfather, there is the problem of being made an offer you can't refuse. So the U.S. has a habit, on behalf of its big corporations, of going to the countries that are reliant on it in military alliances, who have other kinds of foreign policy common interests, and basically saying, come into a free trade agreement with us. It's the best deal you've ever had. Figure out how you're going to sell it. That's part of it. The other part is the U.S. and New Zealand ideologically have been some of the countries that have been the early adopters, and only recently in some parts of our political spheres in both countries worrying questioners of this whole ideology underpinning this agreement. So to some degree it's also sort of the coalition of the willing, which is, I believe in it. What happens I'm less interested in. I believe in it. And so the combination of that, we asked, so you can't really say no. We're the U.S. And the mindset of, I will take no incoming data that has not worked for years. I will not look.
Right.
I think is how it's happening here.
We have a Prime Minister who's very good at saying, I don't want to see anything that might
He's quite good, isn't he?
create
Jane, this week we've seen Elliott and Aurelius win a Second Circuit United States Court of Appeals ruling overthrowing a legal precedent to side with US hedge funds to penalise Argentina $1.33 billion in penalties from the speculation on Argentine debt in the 1990s. Under the TPP, aren't we opening ourselves up to this type of malicious corporate litigation?
We are, and what's worse is a report that came out a couple of days ago shows that there is now a big business of law firms as ambulance chasers
Right.
who are actually going around saying, oh, this government's going to do something that's going to impact on your profits. We'll go in, you sort of lend us your problem, we'll go in, we'll fund the case, we'll take it all the way through, we'll get the lawyers, we'll do everything, just give us a cut of the...
Right.
And so we've got private equity firms who've turned this into a business. And so, you know, chasing around Libya or anywhere that's a potential hotspot. Indeed, just a couple of weeks ago, in the NAFTA context, there's a US company that has taken a dispute against the moratorium in Quebec on fracking.
Right.
Now, just imagine if our parliamentary commissioner had gone further than she did a couple of days ago and say we should have a moratorium. All the little ambulance chasers from the law firms here and offshore will be running around. And that's even under our existing agreements.
Right.
The difference with the Trans-Pacific Partnership is, one, it's US companies. US is litigious.
Yep.
Yeah?
Yep.
And they are notorious for running cases, not simply because they think they might win, but for what we call the chilling effect of getting governments to back off. Now, we
Right.
saw with Hobbit,
Right.
yeah?
Yep.
We'll threaten to take this away if you don't increase
Yep.
the subsidies and change your labour laws overnight.
Yep.
So the US firms are past masters at doing this, and the second problem is the Trans-Pacific Partnership will create far greater rights for those companies and New Zealand companies who boomerang it back on us than any of our existing agreements.
Laura, you've testified in front of 30 congressional committees dealing with free trade. You've looked these politicians in the eye. Why do you think they side with deals that don't benefit anyone other than a small elite? Why do you think it is?
Cha-ching!
It's money.
Corporate money into the campaign coffers. I mean, in our country, and I'm not speaking out of school, we're having a severe crisis of democracy. I mean, corporate campaign money has become a cancer that is really eroding the meaning of real democracy in our country. We had a Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United that literally declared corporations are people and must be declared to have free speech rights. So for instance, I think that the fact that there are so many members of Congress who, for different reasons, have stood up and started screaming about TPP is actually, under that very sick corporate-funded campaign context, the really interesting news. Because when you stand up, as a variety of U.S. members of Congress have, and say, Big Pharma, that's obscene. You're going to use TPP to jack up the cost of AIDS drugs in Vietnam and destroy Pharmac, something we're trying to emulate here. We oppose that. That means not only will they never get a contribution from any of these companies and they have to privately finance their races, but these companies are going to recruit some person to run against them and put millions into their race. And this is not hypothetical, because you're talking about that Argentina case. You don't have to be Argentina and have a financial crisis. You can just make a PPP contract, a public-private partnership contract, with a company as a government, Ecuador. You can decide in that contract to sell the terms. The private company breaches it and does not fulfill, for instance, putting the money into creating the railroad they said they would run. They have neither put down the rail nor bought the rolling stock. You wait 3 years, you say, this is problematic, it's our main line, we are going to cancel the contract. The contract says if you do not do these things by these dates, we will cancel the contract. End of story, right? No financial crisis, nothing extraordinary. In that case, under a tribunal that TPP would expand, the U.S. company went into one of these corporate tribunals and extracted $18 million, as well as never doing the work they did under contract. For what? That seemed unfair. We're interpreting the treaty. I think your investor rights have been breached. So in this instance, for the members of Congress who stand up, for that kind of corporate raiding to occur and call it what it is unfortunately what's extraordinary.
Jane, the OECD this week warned that a global recession was still a very real possibility with a fiscal cliff and Eurozone crisis still unresolved. Your critics will claim you're a Luddite who wants to cost New Zealand our trading edge at a time when we can least afford it. What are your alternatives to free trade?
Well, one of the interesting sets of discussions in the last couple of days, Christchurch and Wellington, has been from the innovation community, from the IT sector, who are out there doing the really creative 21st century development strategies. And they are as frustrated as we are with this process. Not only will the intellectual property parts that have been leaked from this text absolutely cripple the innovation sector, but the officials don't listen to them. They work on their template and their ideology, and the real work happening on the ground is completely out of sight, out of mind. And so if we want to have a real discussion about economic development strategies in this country, we need to have it here, not to have it dictated by whatever rules are signed off in secret by our trade negotiators without us having a say.
Thank you, panel. Moving on to issue 3 tonight. Does the TPP represent the new American-China-Pacific Cold War friction? Jane, Terence O'Brien from the Centre of Strategic Studies this week cautioned against the TPP for fear it would alienate China's own regional comprehensive economic partnership. If this is the Asian century, why is New Zealand handcuffing itself to America?
Well, that was part of a discussion yesterday at a symposium that we had in Wellington, and it was really interesting because there were lots of discussions around the foreign policy and security issues. And what is really clear is that, and Laurie can expand on this, the foreign policy objectives of America reinserting itself in the region are a major driver. Right? And it's becoming a bit like there's an old-fashioned trade academic in the US who described this as competitive imperialism. Yeah, it's imperialism in its contemporary form. It's the Cold War being fought out through the medium of so-called free trade agreements. Right. And we're pincered in the middle here. We've got this growing dependency on China, as has Australia, as have all of the ASEAN members of this negotiation, who are a part of this negotiation kicks off next month for a regional, closer economic partnership, which will be a China-style model. And then, on the other hand, we're negotiating with the US for US-led rules that would be binding and enforceable. We would be expected to comply with both, and we would be expected to do the bidding of the US on the one hand and China on the other. And it is crazy.
Laurie, post-September 11, the US ratcheted up its bilateral economic partnerships as a deliberate strategy. Is the TPP a deliberate empire-building adventure, I suppose, in the face of an ascending China? Is that what's really driving things here?
What's very interesting is that there's a divide. Our Commerce, Treasury, and Trade Representative's Office, their goal for this is NAFTA on steroids, uber alles.
Right.
They want to impose, lock in, cement in those corporate rules and constraints on government, and that's their agenda. And they had been largely controlling the discussion of it to the extent there was discussion.
Sure.
But in the last year or so, the State Department, which deals with their foreign policy, Secretary Clinton, had been saying over here on the sidelines about TPP as a real tool to contain China, to constrain China.
Yeah.
And they seem to actually be winning out, in part because the economic argument's a very hard one to win for the U.S.
Right.
But President Obama, during the presidential campaign, in the debate, shockingly, explicitly told the American public that we are proudly negotiating agreements in Asia without China to put pressure on China. And he described it as part of our Pacific pivot to show we're a power, and then went on to describe the new military bases in Australia. So everyone kind of thought, given how the public in the United States hates across Democrats, Republicans, independents, these kind of agreements, we thought, oh, that's just a political thing for the election, except last week he was even more direct about this being a containment strategy, to the point that our New York Times ran a story saying is TPP the new anti-China strategy of the Obama administration?
Yeah.
And the interesting thing here is that Grosser has said he would walk away from the table if the TPP became a China-bashing exercise.
So that's a real issue for us,
When's he going to walk?
Final question to both on this then. How does China respond to the TPP?
Well, with their normal kind of diplomacy, they have been setting up this alternative framework.
That's right.
China is in really the dominant position here. I mean, if you look at where the US is going to be in the next century and where China's going to be, they have the ability to sort of sit and wait. But at the same time, they're not going to be tolerant to a growth of military presence in the region, and they're not going to be tolerant to the US trying to hijack those that are its allies in the region. And I think we are looking for a really messy kind of Cold War combination of the old militarist ideological economic strategies that we saw was so devastating so many years ago.
How does China respond to this?
China's response, which was in the New York Times story, was kind of interesting. They said, well, we haven't been invited to join TPP, and also we note that the rules being put forward there seem to be created explicitly so we couldn't join. In the past, they've been rather more fierce in responding to the notion of the U.S. using TPP as a way to hedge fence them. And it wasn't a happy response. I would just leave it at that. Though diplomatic.
Let's wrap the show with a final word. Jane, your final word this week. What are you looking for from the activism that we're going to see over the next couple of weeks?
Well, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to put the spotlight on the TPP, and they have an objective to try to tie it up by October next year, possibly followed by a political summit at which all of the political leaders led by Obama schmoozing everyone will try to pull off a deal irrespective of how bad it is for us. We have to make the political conditions here such that neither national-led government nor a Labour-led coalition can make this happen. And the next 10 days of activities in Auckland, that is our goal, to set the foundations for that environment.
Laurie, what are your hopes over the next couple of weeks here in New Zealand?
The bottom line about these agreements is if they're exposed to the sunshine of public scrutiny, they go away. So repeatedly, these crazy U.S. NAFTA on steroid corporate Trojan horse takeover agreements, like the Free Trade Area of the Americas, which was TPP for Latin America, when actually a debate happens, when the text gets out, when there's public discussion, when parliamentarians realize what really is going on under that brand of trade expansion, these agreements either get dramatically changed or they go away. So what I'm looking forward to is actually continuing to expose what the agreement really is about, sort of like the Dracula strategy. You drag it into the sunshine, and like Dracula, it does not fare well.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Jane. Ladies and gentlemen, my final word. Free trade with America is a little bit like good cancer and clean coal. They don't exist. The only people who seem to benefit from this type of free trade agreement are the corporations who wrap themselves in the American flag for pretense purposes only. Working Americans are as much a victim in these deals as working New Zealanders and the workers in developing countries who end up without jobs and no labour law protections whatsoever. We all pay a price to make this new globalised lowest cost capitalism turn a profit. With the news media set to stunned after the Hobbit preview, citizens need to be made aware of how far-ranging the secret trade deal actually is. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. We are back next week with more TPP coverage as the conference in Auckland starts. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.